Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. We're giving just 1 minute to allow people who are in the waiting room to start this dialogue. Okay. Okay, I think we can start. It's 10:02. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Welcome to the second dialogue on Indigenous Peoples' territories, stories of resilience. It's an honor to have all of you as part of this initiative. We are very happy to have people connecting from different parts of the world. We invite you to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you are connecting from. I am Luisa Castaneda-Quintana, the coordinator of the dialogues and the host of today's session that is about challenging scientific hierarchies through Indigenous people knowledge. It's a pleasure to be here with you in the session number 2 with Tania Martínez-Cruz. Unfortunately, John Fernandez-de-Larrinoa cannot connect today. He sent apologies. He has a last minute commitment with his organization that he cannot miss, but for sure we are gonna have him in another dialogue. We are very honored to have you, Tania, today. Thank you so much. Today's conversation will be in part based on the comment published in Food and Nature by the Global Hub of Indigenous People Food System that is titled Rethinking Hierarchies of Evidence for Sustainable Food System, where Tania is a co-author and member of the Global Hub. We are sharing the paper in the chat for you later reading, if it's okay for you. Before I start, I would like to ask you, as you might know, to turn off your microphone, and you are invited to have your cameras on. We will have around 15 minutes dialogues with our special guests, and after that, we're gonna open a session for questions from the participants. With this in mind, let's open this event with some welcoming remarks from a co-sponsor of the dialogues. We have a very esteemed speaker, Simon Filatro, the co-president of Indigenous Law Association, ILADA. Simon, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? I think so, yeah. Kwe aweti, Simon Ihati, Wendat Endi Ashkelania Eves. Hello everyone, my name is Simon. I am a proud Huron Wendat from Wendake. And I hope you're all doing great wherever you are. Personally, I am currently in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, unceded Indigenous lands of the Anishinaabe and Kanyankal nations. As Luisa mentioned, I am also a law student at McGill University. I am in my final year, fourth and final year, and I act as the co-president of the Indigenous Association, or ILADA. Let me say a few words on land acknowledgement. So before every event of ILADA, we take a moment to remind ourselves that we stand, and McGill stands on unceded Indigenous lands on which the Anishinaabe and Kanyankal nations have long been recognized as the custodians of these lands and waters. However, given the current remote context, we may be dispersed all over the province, the country, or the world. So let's acknowledge the historical practices of the colonial empires to unilaterally take Indigenous lands away from them. Here in Canada, the British Crown and now the Canadian Crown has asserted their authority on Indigenous lands based on colonial doctrines. So let's honor, recognize, and respect these sovereign nations as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which states like Canada stand today. That being said, what is the Indigenous Association and why are we hosting such an event? So we are a student-led group that advocates for greater awareness on Indigenous legal, political, and social issues. We pursue our mission by creating healthy and respectful spaces of discussion and reflections. And these spaces take many forms. For instance, it is our social media accounts, our Indigenous Law Journal, Rooted, or events like the series of dialogues we are resuming right now. The idea here is to spark meaningful conversations on Indigenous peoples, their realities, endeavors, and positive contributions to the world, while also involving a broad audience from students to scholars to the larger public. The last dialogue dealt with the impact of global issues affecting Indigenous peoples. And this present dialogue addresses the challenges that arise from the prevalence of Western scientific knowledge over traditional Indigenous knowledge. I strongly believe there's a connection between the two, in the sense that one of the reasons why Indigenous peoples are so affected by global issues, such as climate change, is exactly because Western society has completely ignored Indigenous traditional knowledge. And now everyone is suffering the consequences. On this point, it is fundamental to integrate more seriously traditional Indigenous knowledge, not only because it would be discriminatory to do otherwise, but also because everyone would benefit from it. Last year, and I'll finish on this, Luisa, we invited none other than Mrs. Shala Watloutier to give us a presentation on Inuit legal traditions. And she said something that still resonates with me today. And I quote, "The medicine that the world seeks is the Indigenous knowledge and wisdom." I think this is really powerful. So I'll stop here and turn the floor back to you, Luisa.
Thank you so much, Simon, for acknowledging the territory and recognizing the relevance of these dialogues, and also for introducing the very important topic that we are going to discuss today is about challenging hierarchies of knowledge. After these very important opening remarks, now we are moving to the introduction of our special guest, Tania Martínez-Cruz from Mexico. Tania Eulalia Martínez-Cruz is an Indigenous Inuit woman, an interdisciplinary researcher, a scientist. She holds a BSc in Irrigation Engineering from Chapingo Autonomous University, a master's in Agricultural and Biosystem Engineering from the University of Arizona, and also a PhD in Social Science from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Currently, she works as a consultant for the Indigenous Peoples Unit at FAO, and she is an associate researcher at the Free University of Brussels. She is a board member of the Indigenous Partnership for Agrobiodiversity and Food Sovereignty and the Global Hub on Indigenous People Food System. You can see Tania's complete bio in the chat if you want to. So Tania, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. We are very pleased to have you here in the second dialogues on Indigenous people and have the opportunity to talk about challenging scientific hierarchies through Indigenous people's knowledge, which is a very hot topic, as we're going to discuss later. But also this is an opportunity to talk about you, to know about your views as an Indigenous woman, as a scientist. So thank you so much, Tania, and welcome. And how are you doing today?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation. And I have to say that it's so nice to see a space like this, because I think one of the way forwards, if we want to challenge the hierarchies of knowledge, it's to open up discussions. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and congratulations for this initiative.
Thank you, Tania. And I haven't met in person, but I've seen her many times, especially last year when the dialogues on the UN UN Food System Summit started. So I was very amazed by her and by her work, and we had the opportunity to work together for a couple of months. So for me, it's a great honor to have you here, Tania. And you know, these dialogues are about a story of resilience of Indigenous peoples. And also that's why I want to start with a personal question for you, because storytelling is very important for Indigenous peoples. And I want to start asking you, like, when you realized you were an Indigenous person, an Indigenous woman, and how and when you start like acknowledging the importance and the role of Indigenous people's knowledge in your people, and And also I was wondering whether that was what motivates you to be a scientist and to be the person you are now.
Now, that's a really interesting question, and I appreciate it. And I like the word realizing, because I think I describe usually my journey as an encounter and disencounter with worlds. Like in my community, my grandmother used to call, for example, the Netherlands or Europe another world. And I think she was right in the sense that things are perceived in a different way. So the first time I realized I was different, because it was more realizing I was different, and not so much because I felt I was different. In my community, in the mountains in Oaxaca, Mexico, for me, it was like normal to see my aunties, my grandmothers speaking Mije. The official language in Mexico is Spanish, but I was raised bilingual, speaking Mije and Spanish. But to me, like, everything was normal in the mountains. So the first time I encountered, and it is sad to say it in this way, that I was different was because of racism, and I was 5 years old. My parents moved temporarily to Mexico City. My friends make fun of me when these days I describe Mexico City as this huge monster, because that's the way I used to see it when I was a little girl. And I describe it in the same way. To me, it's like a big monster. And I realized it was different because clearly, for example, now that many of us speak English as a second or third language, it's clear that we will have an accent. It's clear that we will struggle to have like the language flow easily. And I think that happened to me when I was in Mexico City. So it was, let's say, it was a society that made me realize that I was different. And then I learned the concept of an indigenous person when I came to Mexico City. And I think I didn't value so much the roots, but I have to say, not because I feel proud of it, but just because we see these days that languages are endangered, knowledge is endangered. And I think we have been exposed to several processes of discrimination, and that those processes, many times when you ask, for example, the parents, why are you not teaching the native language to children? It's because they don't want them to go through the same process of discrimination. If you want to fit in a mainstream society, then that means sometimes that you have to let go what you are. It feels that way. It's not like you have to, but it feels that the system sometimes pushes you into that direction. So I have to say that for some time I didn't want to speak Mije, but luckily, I always say luckily, my grandmother didn't speak Spanish, and many of my aunties didn't speak Spanish. So if I wanted to get back to the dynamic in the community, I had to be forced to speak Mije again. And I didn't value that so much till I started my bachelor's, but later my master's mainly, because I started to work for development organizations. And then for me, yes, I was trained as an engineer, and I believed in the role of science and technology to improve people's lives. For example, I'm describing a rural area where I was raised that didn't have access to education. Not all of the areas. My parents were teachers, indigenous teachers. And that's another important topic, because we talk a lot about intercultural education, but I think in the Mexican system, when most of the educational initiatives started, most of them wanted indigenous populations to forget who they were, and also like try to incorporate them into the mainstream monolingual systems. It didn't mean like they would allow you to speak Mije, but then there was a whole movement that said, why should I let go who I am? I think it's important to keep who I am. And then they started to fight, at least for a bilingual system. I think the aim is still to have intercultural education at the local level, but I think there's a lot that we still need to do. And that links to the whole thing of challenging hierarchies of knowledge, but I will connect the dots later. But then when I started to work for these development organizations, then I realized, okay, so why is that we promoting some technologies and some pathways and not others? And the classical example that I give is that when I was in the mountains of Chiapas working for a project, the project that we were working on said, let's improve Mexico's food security by increasing maize yields. And then when we arrived to the mountains, one of my colleagues asked me, hey, Tania, don't you think this system is a bit primitive? The milpa system, which is an intercropping of maize, potatoes, beans, and fruit trees and other stuff. And then I was like, no, I think it's good. It's a milpa system. But that was my only answer. And then I started to reflect on what happened in that space. And for him, we needed to change the crop distance, the density of plantation, if we wanted to increase maize, if we were seeing food security as a synonym of maize production, because maize is a staple crop in Mexico. But then we were forgetting to see that a farmer needs potatoes, needs beans, and different herbs and plants that they find in that system that seems too simple, but it's complex, and they can find a food that they can harvest through the year. But also that if you want to see it from the biophysical perspective, nitrogen, it's a crucial element, we know, in agriculture for soil and plants, and beans help you fixing it. Then the maize climbs, no, the beans climb the maize plants because they need something that helps them to grow. And then the pumpkin with the leaves that are huge help you to reduce erosion. So when you think about the complexity and the beauty of the whole system, then it's not only increasing maize yields. And that is when I started to think back home and say, wow, there's a lot of knowledge. I went to university. I went to learn about techniques to improve crop production, to improve many processes, but I forgot about the knowledge that was back then, back in these communities, in my own community, because we had milpa systems in my community. And that's when I decided not necessarily to disconnect the worlds, but like thinking how is that we can connect these knowledge systems in a better way.
Tania, you make me connect what you just said with a question that I have for the last moment. And it's because you were educated in Mexico, in the US, in Europe, and I wanted to ask you, like, how your indigenous knowledge and positionality as an indigenous woman was challenged by the professor, by the advisors, and by the university, by the system, and how you reconcile with that. Because after that, you went to the university, you say you started reflecting what you learned in the university for getting something about indigenous knowledge. So made me wonder about this question.
I don't think I was challenged so much, because the first years of my career, I was like focusing more in technical aspects, doing water management, irrigation, biofuel. So I spoke too little about indigenous knowledge back then. But I think the later, when I started my PhD and I knew I wanted to do politics of technologies, politics of knowledge, which knowledge matters more than other. I had good supervisors, but I have to say that because I did my PhD in collaboration with an international NGO based in Mexico, the first time I went to them and said, I want to do something, I have a scholarship, I have my funding, and I want to do it in milpa systems. And I remember that the agenda back then, it wasn't focused on indigenous cropping systems. They were like, it sounds good, but we're not working with native crops or milpa systems. If you want to do your PhD with us, you have to change your focus of it. And what was interesting is that 2 years later, when we had a change in government, they embraced indigenous knowledge as part of the initiative. So to me, a lot of the work that we do as scientists is political, because if we want to get funding, and you see that with COP26 now, like a lot of people, it's claiming now that they're doing research with indigenous peoples, research including indigenous knowledge, because there was an official statement that said we're gonna give money to indigenous peoples, and everyone is fighting for that funding, and everyone is gonna say they are doing work with them. And I think it's very political. So going back to your question, I think not necessarily in terms of indigenous knowledge, but I would say that as a woman, as an indigenous woman, I feel like I have to be legitimizing myself in different spaces. And I guess many of you, if you coming from indigenous backgrounds, probably face the same challenge. And I love using the expression that sometimes when you're advocating for several causes at the same time, it's like you were dating several people at the same time, because in your will to satisfy all the people that you want to work with, you end up not satisfying or dissatisfying some, and then it's not a good position. And I say that too, because it also means that you have to be living in different worlds. For example, 2 years ago, I was appointed. We still have something that we call in Mexico usos y costumbres, which is basically that the community appoints you for 1 year of community service, not payment, but because you're part of the community. And you have to do the rituals, you have to do it in the way. And then the conception of time to me is really interesting, because time there, or the way the system or the way the norms, things work in the community are so totally different on the way that it works as a researcher, where you have everything in your agenda, everything happens from 1 hour to other. And there is just like, you have to let go with what's happening in the community. And I think for me, that's been one of the biggest challenges. Linking that in terms of academia, yes, many times, because many times you're challenged if you really know what you like proposing, or it's more because you're a quota for a minority. And it's upsetting, because it feels like you have to be fighting every single space, every single time, legitimizing who you are, what you do, that you know what you do. And I think in my case, in a way, it has helped me that I have an interdisciplinary background, because I try to play with numbers, because again, when we go to some spaces, especially with scientists that come from hard science or economists, they are like, okay, yes, indigenous knowledge is so pretty, but so what? How is that it's contributing? How if you give me numbers of what we can actually achieve and do with that? And so, yeah, you have to be legitimizing and validating a lot of things in several spaces.
And what you just say, about the COP26, the money that governments and organizations are pledging to research with indigenous peoples, and she's connected to other idea of the question I had. I wanted to ask you, because sometimes we talk about this, that researchers, non-indigenous researchers, for instance, go to indigenous people's territory to extract their knowledge, practices, and sometimes they just want to have indigenous people in the projects, as you just say, to get funding. So it seems like you mentioned that the inclusion of indigenous people in research is only a token gesture to satisfy, for instance, a funding agency. So how to prevent this? What are your recommendations, to avoid this? When people doing research with indigenous people, to avoid extracting their knowledge and instead work in collaboration and most respectfully with them.
It's an interesting topic, because I love saying that many times we say we have moved more into participatory approaches and inclusion. And to me, it feels like we're just renaming things many times and not changing so much the practices at grassroots levels. But just like trying to be a bit more positive, I would say that, for example, your colleague that talked, I'm sorry that I'm really bad at names, that spoke at the beginning. When I see more people engaged in academia, when I see more people trying to collaborate with the system, if you want to call it this way, people from indigenous communities, I think that's the way. If there are many spaces, and in a way, that's why I decided to go and pursue a scientific career, if we believe in the role of science and technology in advising policy. I think many times people is not aware of the different worlds that are out there. And if you want to increase, I love this saying of the Zapatista movement in Mexico, that it says, let's build a world where many other worlds fit. But how can we build this world where many other worlds fit? Well, we need to bring up more voices that are active in policy, in science. And I think we need to create a network of that. So for example, I know the institute, the Native Nations Institute in Arizona, has developed some guidelines on research accountability, transparency, and what are the protocols that people should follow, that researchers should follow when they want to come and work with communities. I know that the Inuit Council has something similar, and I think that's the way that we should be going, that we need also to teach the people from outside. If they want to work with us, if they want to collaborate with us, there are some standards that they should follow, because yes, indeed, it feels very extractive in many ways. And yeah, I think we can switch those dynamics, but it requires some people that is willing to listen, some people that is willing to learn, I always give the example on how when we develop a development project, we always want people to learn something from the experts, but we don't consider many times the local people as the experts. Are we, as the researchers, as the implementers of many of these projects, of many of these policies and initiatives, are we willing to learn, to co-learn or produce, like it was beautifully said in the flyer that you said, are we willing to co-produce knowledge, policy, strategies together where we like see each other as equals?
What you know, I was reading the chat, and what you just said also resonated with Amber Lane mentioning, you know, about like conducting like free, prior, and informed consent process. You know, you also mentioned before doing research with Indigenous peoples and created this. Myself, I'm no Indigenous person, but I'm doing research with Indigenous people, so I'm in the middle of this process. I just want to close this about research, because I want to go back to the beginning, Tania, you allow me. And I want to talk because you were like mentioning when we started how you realized you were like different, no? That's how you put it. And I saw you were talking about the importance of languages. But I wanted to, you know, like maybe you can share with us what is that, you know, because when we talk about Indigenous knowledge, we always talk about the importance of women, Indigenous women, and the importance of languages, no? So you can tell us, you know, and perhaps with example, you started talking about your grandmother. So like, what is, you know, how is that so important, the role of Indigenous women in preserving knowledge and languages?
Yeah, I would say with languages, I will start saying, I will quote a famous linguist from Mexico that she says, languages don't die, we kill the speakers. And when we kill the speakers, then we lose those languages, and that's when we lose all the knowledge. And how is that we kill the speakers? Well, just like if we look at the current statistics on how many Indigenous peoples are dying, threatened, especially in the defense of territory, coming back to the topic of COP26. I think 1/3 of the people that has been murdered in defense of territory, because that's the way Indigenous peoples pose it. It's yes, it's climate action. That's the way we frame it in a bigger narrative. But what it means for many people, it's they are losing their homes, they are losing their knowledge, they are losing their houses, they are losing the ability to be resilient. And just like going back to some of the numbers, I think that the statistics that the 80% of the biodiversity that it's remaining in the world maintained in 25 of the indigenous in 35 of the territory, and that it's kept in just in 6% of the populations that correspond to Indigenous people, that tells you a lot already, right? So we should be caring about them, learning, and not be threatening them as the current system is doing. And it's sad. I think I read that every 3 months a language dies or the speakers die. And there's like an extreme relation, or some people has found a relation that places with a higher linguistic diversity are also spots for higher biodiversity. So there's something important to do about language, but not only about language and documenting them like we do in the museums. We have to keep the speakers. We have to reinforce the speakers. We have to support the people. For women, yes, I think we play a crucial role. My grandmother was a wise woman. We call them shumar, which means someone that reads through the days. I cannot find the right translation, but basically makes it so important for our culture that she could, when we do energy balancings, we have this idea that we have to thank Mother Earth for the things that we receive in life. But she was the person that would read the maze and guide my people when she was alive. So I think there's a lot of knowledge kept by women. Like, for example, just if we also translate it and link it a bit to the development projects, for example, women are in charge of the diets. They know what to harvest, when to harvest, what to feed you, when you're sick, what you should eat, what you should take just to cure you. And there's like a lot of knowledge that gets lost again when we lose the speakers. Just to give you another example, I was recalling recently, because I asked to write something on the importance of indigenous knowledge, that my grandmother could tell you what was the date just by looking at the moon and the stars. And that's something that I remember I used to do at 4 a.m. with her, but I think something I missed. And coming back to why I got engaged into advocating for indigenous knowledge is because I feel like we're losing a lot of those things, because yeah, the system hasn't valued enough what it's already there. But I think women are crucial, also face many challenges. Just coming back to different projects that are implemented in indigenous areas, if we talk about land tenure, many times women don't have access to land tenure. Someone brought in the chat the informed consent also for development projects. How can you consult someone if they don't have rights to land tenure? And that's many times one of the issues with these development projects. So I think there are a lot of things that we need to do. And it's nice that we're starting to open the dialogue in these issues.
So you made it clear, how important indigenous women are, for indigenous people, traditional knowledge systems. And I just want to get back to this because I want to read it, because there is an initiative by the organization Rights and Resources. And I think I read it like 2 weeks ago, when they mentioned that indigenous women's organizations receive only 0.7% of all of human rights funding in 2010-2013, despite using, managing, and conserving over 50% of the world's land. So you just mentioned, like they are not part of the table when decisions are made, and when there are the burdens of knowledges, and also they are not consulted, they don't have rights. So what do you think is needed, to overcome this issue where women participation is lacking?
I think it's a really complex issue, because yes, there are a lot of things that we can say about indigenous communities, but indigenous communities are also complex. And I see that in my own community. Like, for example, recently, not recently, it was like a year ago, not so recently, there was an event about political participation of women, and it was run by some people from the city. And I'm not saying this to be judgmental, but more like to put in context that the issues are complex. And people were saying, yeah, but we need more women to participate in the political life. And there was someone that from an indigenous community said, yes, I've been elected in my community. But in my community, she said, we are religious, so we'll link many of these community services with a religious part that we are linked to. It's religious, not Catholic, but like the praising to different elements of nature, sacred places that we have. And then she said, the disadvantage if I want to advance more in the political arena, yes, it would be nice I do it, but that doesn't take away all the things I have to do. Because if a man gets elected, the man gets support from the mother if he's single, or the sister if he's single, so he can advance more. But if I get elected, and if I want to have a political participation, that also means that if I have someone sick at home, I still have to take care of that person at home. If I have children, if I'm a single mother, I still have to take care of my children. If my partner is not from the community, I still have to fulfill my duties in the municipality, but also with my family. So I think we need to increase awareness also. I'm not going to say the communities or the indigenous peoples are homogeneous. It might be that the dynamics are different from one place to other, but I think there's also a lot of things that we need to, areas where we need to raise awareness also in the communities. For example, I was super proud this year that for the first time I saw a march on the 8th of March in my community. And I think 2 years ago, we also had a dialogue on what it means to be empowered, or what are the challenges that we face inside the community, because it's so different to put it Like when I talk about feminism, for example, and what it needs to be advanced on the rights of women in the city, or when I'm like playing in this other different world, it's so different when I go back to my community, because the reality it's complex and a bit different. So I think we need to be more open to speak about many of these challenges, but we have to be aware that these challenges are different from one place to other. And yeah, maybe I'm not answering your question, but I just want to put into context that it's such a complex issue, and that we need to be careful when we discuss it too, because I don't want to end up like homogenizing, which is I think one of the problems that we have many times.
Because this can take us to other discussions, but I want to just hold it like a minute there, because I want to, go back when you say that Indigenous people hold 80% of the biodiversity in just a quarter of the surface, if I'm not wrong. So and a lot has said that Indigenous people's contribution to global challenges like climate change and combat food insecurity. So in order to go with other questions, I would like you can talk about this, like perhaps based on the experience of your community and other people that you have worked with, like how is like Indigenous people knowledge is really contributing to these global challenges?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I'm going to quote some of the things that FAO has been doing the last years. Because I think first, I'm going to talk from the perspectives of food systems. That is my specialization. Usually we see everything in terms of production in mainstream. But I think one of the positive things of Indigenous people's food systems, and I guess we can translate that to other areas too, it's about gathering. So you're not, usually when I talk to agronomists, for example, everything it's how much are we producing per unit of water, per unit of soil, per unit of fertilizer, etc. And I was mentioning this example of the milpa systems. And I always tell people that, for example, even when the field it seems to be entirely clean because there's no maize or plants on the surface, you can dig underground and find roots that people eat. In the rainy season, you go and harvest mushrooms. So you're not producing, you're gathering. You have something I miss a lot from my community, and some of the memories I have from my community as a child is like I would go and be climbing trees from different fruits through the year. Pears, peaches, cherries, bananas, depending on what was available according to the season. And I think that's something amazing because you go to the market, I don't know, spend 10 American dollars and I can buy the supermarket or all the things that I need for the whole week. And it's something from the season. I think that's something that we have missed when we go to we are also a bit spoiled because we go to the market and imagine someone, for example, in Europe, when I was living in the Netherlands, that I wanted my avocados for my guacamole. And you cannot grow avocados in the Netherlands, for example. But I think we have also lost the ability to see what's around us and what can we harvest. And I think that's something that Indigenous peoples do. Also, another example is about food waste. We say that the 30% of the food is wasted. And I remember that when we had rituals in my community, we would use eggs and chickens, for example. The first day you would eat something with a soup, like with the eggs that you use for the ritual. The next day you would make a chicken soup. The third day you would make tamales, which is like a Mexican dish, but you still use some of the soup that you produced the first day. And then you will eat the chicken transformed into several things through the whole week to reduce the waste. And then to me, that was also, so I'm going this weekend to my house, to my hometown, and we have to make some rituals, and we're staying a bit longer just because we want to go through all these processes of the different foods that we want to eat with one ritual. And I think that's also something that we have missed, and that's something that we can learn from Indigenous peoples. The other thing is thinking about nutrition. Many times we have undermined many of the knowledge of the foods because we think of them as something primitive. But I was just like thinking in one of the examples of a friend from Siberia that she was telling me, we don't suffer from deficiencies of vitamin D because what we do is like we eat fish, we eat deer, we can eat it like as soon as we hunt it, drink the blood, and it's rich in nutrients. But many times when we trying to produce again recommendations, we make the recommendations from what we know, but we don't necessarily go and see what's there, what people prefers. And one of the examples that I love the most is that I met a Peruvian indigenous person, a Wahun person in like a year ago. And he was telling me, just for me to understand, he said, how is that they face many of these initiatives that people brings, is that he took some worms to a Minister of Social Development and said, I got you a present, and put them on the table. And the minister screamed and said, what do you want me to do with these worms? Like just odorized in a way. And then he was like, but it's a present. We love them. We eat them. They are nutritious. And then she was like, but I don't eat worms. And then he was like, yeah, but that's the way we feel when you bring us things that do not fit us. When you don't ask us first, what do we want? What is the way that we live? That's the way we feel. You see what's happening here? And then she was like, okay, so we need to improve many of these things. And also I think another element, it's like the biocentric approach that we give value to nature. It's not human centered because many times we are just like getting. And I think many of the processes, for example, in just something as simple as cultivating maize, you pour some mezcal, which is a typical beverage in Mexico, to thank the Mother Earth. Just I was talking about the complexity of the systems, like a milpa system seems to be too simple for some people, but then when you realize the different elements and that all of them have a function, then you realize there's a lot of complexity and knowledge in these systems. And as such, probably in other regions, the people in Canada probably can tell me that they have many examples also in which they have these techniques or they have these relationships with nature or their livelihoods that are also more harmonious with nature.
And Tania, now you just mentioned about the complexity of indigenous people knowledge and how they can really provide solutions, for things like food insecurity that is a global threat. And I want to connect what you just said with the article, the article on rethinking hierarchies of evidence for sustainable food system that was published by the Global Hub on Indigenous Food Systems. And because it's gonna take us to this topic about challenging hierarchies of knowledge. So in this article, the Global Hub, and you are a co-author, mentioned that there are hierarchies of evidence where traditional knowledge systems are relegated to the lowest level. And why, despite that being practiced for millions of people, giving like food, biodiversity, protecting the ecosystems, the system that embodies the knowledge of indigenous people. Why do you think these knowledge systems are often regarded as unscientific or less scientific and continue to be marginalized in policy and practice?
I think that in a way links to the systematic racism or marginalization of indigenous peoples. We have to remember that a lot of the Western world that came to or went to many indigenous communities also believed of themselves as superior, and it's a system that has been predominating, and it's been reflected in science too. That they have set rules, like just like that in some soils that are a particular, they would not fare well, and also because they are demanding more specific inputs. Whereas some of these native seeds are adapted to many of these environments, and it took millions of years for people to adapt this knowledge to. So they know what they are doing. They are just not systematizing it in the way we do it as scientists or we are taught to do it, but they know what they are doing. For example, there's one technique that I like a lot and in the Mixteca part in Oaxaca, Mexico. It's super dry, but people dig the hole to put the seed maize like 30 centimeters because it's too dry, but they try to use the humidity that it's still in the soil to allow the plants to grow. Imagine, how is that they knew that, it's called a cajete system. How is that they knew they could do that? Like some seeds that are more adapted to a higher altitudes, to lower altitudes. We were talking about resilience. And when I talk to farmers, for example, from some indigenous communities, and they tell you, there's one story I love from one Zapotecan community. When you make a historical reconstruction and see how the systems have changed, they tell you that they reduced their resilience when they stopped having a diversity of fields. What they used to do in the past is like they would have like 7 fields, some in the higher parts of the mountains, something next to the river. If something goes wrong because there's a flooding and they lose the part that it's in the river, they still had the fields that were in the higher lands, but the maize that they had in the higher lands is not the same one they had in the lower lands, because seeds are adapted to particular conditions, but at the same time, they need these seeds for specific foods. When you ask some people, I don't know, I would like you to think of a food that it's well done for a specific type of rice. If you're coming from Asia, that you probably know that the different uses of rice. If you're from the Andes, that you can have potatoes for different dishes, and you cannot use the same potatoes for the same dishes. And it's the same for us in Mexico. And these farmers would tell you that, and they would explain why it was important to have such diversity. Then you think, wow, this is a lot of knowledge. And they might not have recorded it as we are taught in mainstream science, but tell me if this is not science. All the adaptation that they have developed for extreme or different environments in the world. So just to give you another example is like we say that only 3 crops contribute to the 60% of the intake, the caloric intake in the world, which are maize, wheat, and I think it's rice too. I'm not sure if I'm mistaken with the third one. But then also 20 crops are responsible for the 90% of the caloric intake. But then when you look, I invite you to read the Wipala paper for those that haven't read it. I will provide a link later. Some of the experience that we did with the Wipala paper, which also served for this paper that you were mentioning, Luisa, of the hierarchies of knowledge, you see that there are people that have even in one single place up to 250 different crops. Imagine if we're saying that the world relies just on 3 crops, imagine all this other biodiversity that we are undermining and all the knowledge that people has there. Why is that we undermine it? Because probably we don't know how to crop it, how to eat it, how to produce it, how to turn it into something else.
Tania, and when you mention, because you can kind of address the next question is like, what are those elements, values, characteristic of these indigenous people's knowledge, and how this indigenous people knowledge is different from the dominant scientific knowledge or Western knowledge, however we want to call it, how is different, and how they both can complement each other. So maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, I think many times also what happens is that we essentialize and we say it's like divided. And then I see that I think I've seen people trying, because we are aiming to survive. There are many things that are threatening the territories and the people. And people wants to survive and wants to create resiliency and wants to keep on going. So one of the examples I have was mentioning Siberia before. In Siberia, in COP26, they presented how they are using geographical information systems to monitor how the sea levels are rising, how the rivers are changing, how the land use is changing, how this is affecting the food systems, but also how they can use all the evidence to inform policy and tell policymakers, this is what is happening in my territory. And I think the actions that would help us to cope with these changes are A, B, C, D. If I think of the same community that I was mentioning, that they had different plots at different locations. So policy plays an important role, and they started to migrate to other areas. because the government wanted rural people to move to urban areas to be laborers. They kept on cultivating maize because maize was important for some rituals, etc. But then in 2009 and 2010, they had several extreme events, which was a drought, a bridge that joined or connected the region with the cities collapsed, and they ended up locked like for 2 or 3 weeks. And they said, we had money, we didn't have maize. So what's the money worth it for if we don't have maize? They say they had to go to other communities to look for maize. And then they also started to grow the maize again, but now mixing it with technologies. It would be interesting or funny to see a milpa with irrigation, and they have a milpa with irrigation. They changed it a bit, the density plantation. They also have with participatory plant breeding, which is basically using the ounce seeds, but improving the ounce seeds in a more systematic way. I don't know how to say that without like making it sound that they don't doing it in a more systematic way, but let's say someone had told them this is the physiological development of maize and we can improve it much faster. If you were doing this in 10 years, we can do it in 3 years. So they were collaborating with an agronomist, and now they have beautiful milpas. Now they have a competition and love about that experience, because they said we shouldn't have left our farming because that was threatening our resilience. But you see, they are using biofertilizers, they are using mycorrhizas to increase the rooting of the plants, they are using irrigation, even though for some older people in the community was like, no, God has said that we can only crop maize with the rain. And then they were like, no, but we have to continue adapting. And the younger generations started to use irrigation, and now you see how they are also combining these different techniques. There's another example of women in Guatemala that are also producing other foods in the community using irrigation. And they are turning some of the foods into teas, into energetic bars, and they are selling it because they said, if we want to make an income, we want to keep our systems, we want to improve our lives, but then we also need to do something if we want to keep ourselves getting an income and not migrating.
So you talk about, how it's possible to integrate, indigenous people knowledge and this dominant scientific knowledge. And I have a question about this, because like people often ask, how can we integrate indigenous people knowledge into dominant scientific knowledge? And I think that by framing this question in this way shows an unhealthy power dynamic between dominant scientific knowledge and indigenous people's knowledge. So make it sound like there are two singular bodies of knowledge, when in fact, indigenous people knowledge, unlike dominant or Western knowledge, is drawn from thousands of different communities, where you have mentioned some example, like each community, each people has their own knowledge systems. Also, you mentioned it before, that we needed to avoid this homogenization of indigenous people knowledge. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think we need to do to deconstruct this idea of homogenizing indigenous people knowledge?
Yeah, are those two questions?
Yeah, I know, I make like many questions in once.
So it's how can we deconstruct the homogenization of knowledge, of indigenous people's knowledge? That was your question. Okay, so I think we have to acknowledge, I'm gonna keep on mentioning COP26 because I think that's one of the pressure experiences that I have. So we were at COP26, and we were in the March of Fridays for Future, and I was with a group of indigenous women, and they were invited to speak. But when they were invited to speak, the person that presented them like put all the indigenous peoples in one single box. And now they were like, and now we have the indigenous peoples that are here. And then people because I could hear what they were saying from different regions of the world. They were annoyed, and then they were like, the struggles I have in my territory with a mine are different from the struggles I have in the Istmo de Tehuantepec with the eolic parks, and it's different to the problems I have in the Amazonas when they are like drilling oil. And then they were like, and we are so different. I think we have to, yeah, we have to acknowledge, and that's why we use the indigenous peoples, because it's to acknowledge that there's a lot of diversity. It would be like something to say like all the Europeans or all the Americans, and then we would say, hey, whoa, 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 hey, we are different, right? So I think we need to be more open to see that there are, yes, there are differences between us, but not to, I don't know how to respond that, because that's a challenging one. But I think we have to acknowledge that there's diversity. We have to be open to that, but also to be avoiding our own bias, right? Because again, we say indigenous peoples and then we imagine the same. And there's also another thing. We tend to use stereotypes. Just to give you two examples, these people that was marching in Fridays for Future, Greta had agreed to say, indigenous peoples are going to go at the front. I'm not going to march today. And then the group of women that were coming from Mexico were dressing not typical outfits, nothing like this. They were just like normal jeans, sweater. It was cold. And then they were like, no, but this is just a space for indigenous peoples. And then they were like, what do you mean? Yeah, just for indigenous peoples. And they were like, we are indigenous. What do you want me to do? You want me to bring my typical outfit? Don't you think that we dress like you do normally, or what? Right? And then the other experience was of a friend from Russia, that he says, like, for the context of Latin America, I think when he presented, it was an event for peace in Guatemala. And I was like, are you sure you're indigenous? Because you're too white and blonde. And it was like, yeah, but you shouldn't stereotype, because we are diverse. And also he said, and people also tells me why I'm using a mobile phone. And then he was like, we can use mobile phones. It's just, I think there's also a lot of a bias, and people do not understand that we are normal like many other people. Yes, our challenges are different. Yes, the marginalization and discriminations have been historical processes that have been there and that have put us in a vulnerable position. I'm not going to say we are vulnerable per se, citing a Fright Ron that says, no, we're not vulnerable. The system has put us in positions of vulnerability. So I think we need to reteach. We need to decolonize many of these narratives, but I think that's a challenge or a task that many people have to do. It's ourselves as indigenous peoples, but also people like you, scientists, and probably other people that are seeing us there.
Thank you, Tania. Unfortunately, we are running out of time for my questions, and I have so many others. But I want to close the round of questions from my side. One is very policy oriented, and it's because, you know, the recognition of indigenous people's knowledge as valuable is not new, as we have discussed here, and there is a long acknowledgement that indigenous people are well placed to provide expert contribution to global debates. And as I mentioned before, when we're talking about women, you know, they are not still there in the table. So also, I feel that when we talk about indigenous people knowledge, it could be like a traveling tokenistic aspect, you know, almost like ticking a box, you know, to have indigenous people, as you just mentioned now in the experience of the COP26. So what do you think is still missing? What do you think is the role of UN agencies, universities, researchers, states, to make progress towards bridging indigenous people's science with Western science or dominant scientific knowledge? So, and with this, I'm closing my round of questions. So go ahead, Tania, thank you.
I would cite some examples. I think the Global Hub of Indigenous Peoples Food Systems is precisely trying to create a platform where different knowledges can bridge, different actors can bridge, from policymakers, scientists that are based in universities, scientists that are working directly with the communities and that have an indigenous or are indigenous, and because we try to show with the so-called evidence the value of indigenous knowledge. I think something that I have found is that in some people working on indigenous knowledge is like indigenous peoples are more willing to learn from the other world, but the other world it's not so much willing to learn from indigenous peoples. How can we change that? So I think we have found there are some good partners that are scientists that are willing to do that, and I think we should create more synergies in that. My first bet is usually on education, and not because I want to have many scientists, but I think we can change many of these narratives by taking action in many of the positions that have been dominated just by few ones, and more indigenous peoples need to be at these seats. Could be science, could be policy making. I respect totally people that says no, we have to stay at grassroots levels, but I'm a believer that we need people in different fronts if we want to make institutional changes and big changes. That would be one of my things. And what else? I think we also need to be as communities, and I see something I didn't mention, but I think it's important to mention, because we're talking about how nice is indigenous knowledge and how, but I think there are many stories also of a biopiracy, for example, on how people has extracted and not giving credit to communities. And that's what I also think that we need, that our communities are more aware that when someone mentioned that we when mention a prior free consent, that it actually means that. And it doesn't only means that we tick in a box. So I think universities should be making also protocols with that in mind. I was reading, just for example, recently that one university was saying, I need someone that validates that when you ask someone for this consent, there must be a witness that testifies it actually happened, because what many times happens, and I've seen it with many projects where I have worked, that people comes and gives a talk and says, yeah, but they agree. And many times we don't want to acknowledge also scientists that we use a language that might not be, not that it's difficult, but we frame things that it might not be in the best interest of the communities. Why would they want to help me with my science? What are they going to achieve with my science? I think we have to also push donors, people that funds research, that also values different goals, not only a paper, because yes, paper and science is important to produce, but I think we have to be caring also on the impact. And I think I would also invite you in regards to that. We wrote a paper that it's called the Colonizing Ethnobiology. That's one of the papers I love the most, because I think it was a reflection on how we can, value more the knowledge, but also create more ethical relationships with the communities. But let me find it, and then I will.
Thank you, Tania. I just wanted to connect, because I was looking at the chat, and Dennis made a comment. One of the things is when researchers go to indigenous territories, but they don't go back. They don't show the results or the funding of the study. That's actually another issue. I just wanted to highlight his comment. Mariana Estrada, our common friend, she sent me a message and said that she reminded me that Tania was awarded in Mexico with the National Youth Award. She has also been in the list of the most powerful women in Mexico. And for sure, she's opening, as you can see it here, the way in science and education for many indigenous peoples and indigenous women, especially. So thank you, Tania, so much. I'm going to stop here, and I really want to give the floor to other people, and this has been very insightful. I have a question from the chat. Is from Dil Gurun. Sorry if I am mispronouncing. I don't know. You want me to read it, or you want to open the microphone? But yeah, I can go ahead reading it. She said that Transhumanist pastoralism is slowly declining. For example, traditional indigenous practices, including in knowledge, is fading away. How can this affect the biodiversity and food security?
Yeah, I think, well, clearly if it's reducing, there are going to be strong effects in biodiversity. But I think I'm not an expert on pastoralist issues, I have to say. I know much more from the mountains, but I'm going to speak for what I think. I think one of the problems it's been also because many of the pastoralist communities have been pushed to or restricted to move their movement, right? I think it's also like another way of land grabbing, like many other indigenous peoples are facing when they are implementing some projects. So I think particularly, I don't think we have visibilized so much the role of pastoralist communities, and that's an area that we need to improve. Because something I've learned through the years with research is that we love highlighting the pretty stories because those are the ones that sell more. And I guess pastoralist communities face so many challenges that we also need to do more work and advocacy there, and we need to learn more from you. That would be my answer. That deal if you work with pastoralist communities, if you are an indigenous person also that works with pastoralist communities, please reach out to us, because I think, like I said, we need to create synergies, and if there's something that we haven't learned from you, it would be nice to do something.
Thank you, Tania. Someone else has a question, want to intervene, want to get some insight from Tania. Sorry, Patricia. Hi, Patricia. Hola.
Hi, hola. Nice to see everyone here. Tania, just more than a question, perhaps a question, but also a reflection. One of the things we talk about a lot, and I have the good luck to talk to you and some of the colleagues as well, is that these different paradigms, these different global views that we have, somebody calls imperialism, colonialism, but the idea that we start looking at, at your level, at even Luisa's level when we are at the university. But all these things, all these differences are created when we go to kindergarten, when we do not have a connection with a teacher who teaches the children in other languages, that when that person gave the worms, that's what the kids feel when you go to school and you're giving juice, milk, things like, come in a box instead of in a glass, and things like that. So when we have such a different paradigms, which are not bad, but they do not clash, they do not connect, and there is not a system or a structure at the country level that allows these cultures, these paradigms to be, legitimized, then we have people like you, people like Luisa or me or John or many others, like people who are here, who are trying to help, to legitimize, to move. Doesn't think that we need to start earlier. We need to look at the indigenous knowledge and include this from the beginning, like this has been done in some countries. At least my knowledge is in the Andean region, where there have been many attempts to look at they call it indigenous intercultural bilingual, but it's more bilingual than intercultural. So that is what I ask you about Mexico. Do you think that we should start it earlier to connect these worlds? Thank you.
Yes, I think there's another researcher from the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples Food System, Francisco Rosado, and he's written at the level of university, multicultural universities in Mexico. But I think we need to start sooner. We need to, from an early age, from the educational contents, or how you call it, curricula that we design, we need to teach children different. Like when we are, I don't know what subjects that you might be taking in Canada or in the other regions of the world, but when we're learning of nature, maybe instead of putting that we get from nature, portraying that we should having this biocentric approach where we value nature in a different way, in that it doesn't belong to us, but we are just more like an element of it. I think there are many things that can be done at an early stage, and I hope that we can switch things slowly. But again, that's why I think we need more. Not because I want to make this like yes, let's go Indigenous peoples, but yes, we need more people like coming on board in trying to work from different arenas, not only in food, education, policy making. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Patricia. Anyone has a question, someone who wants to intervene or ask something to Tania? Okay, if there is no, okay, Sylvie, go ahead, please.
Let me put my, yes, it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and thank you very much, Tania, for sharing your wisdom. I'm Sylvie Wabbs. I'm working in the Emergency and Resilience Office in FAO and working on resilience. I think resilience and Indigenous people food systems are two, would nearly say synonymous words, because I mean you're the champions of resilience and you know, having food systems that cope and adapt and transform with the various stresses and shocks over centuries. The way we are working, especially on climate risk management and climate risk climate resilience, and the overall value that our economies are having are missing exactly what you have been talking about. And it seems that if we really want to transform, it's not just so much the policy and education and so on, but it's being at the core of this transformation and the economic and political decisions that are needed so that humanity and planet survive, because we are, you know, dealing with these multiple crises and we have a very short time to do that. So I'm just asking on this, you know, political and leverage. I mean, your voice is more and more strong, but how can we really make sure that any decisions for the future, transformation, recovery, whatever you name it, is putting the voice of Indigenous people, you know, up front, especially for the food system, like we know the food system is part of the solution. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a challenging question. I think there are spaces that are trying to, for example, again, we're gonna go back to the COP26. I'm sorry that I'm citing COP26, but that's a fresh event I have in my mind. I think it was one of the delegations that had more Indigenous peoples despite the pandemics. But I think one of the complaints that many of the people I met there were that even though we were there, not many people was actually in the rooms where decisions were made. So for many, the disappointment was like just saying, it seems that it was more like a quota to be there, but not so much on what we can influence. So what can we do? I think there's a lot of mobilization at grassroots levels, and that has like made some positive shifts. But again, I think we still need to take spaces in those spaces. And the way to do it, it's from different areas. Like there are people that it's doing law and it's been advocating and working on that. Other people like me that has chosen the academic path and it's trying to do something from there. I don't think there's like a straight answer, but also like we should push our own governments. Like just something as simple. Probably Luisa has the numbers fresher than me. If she remembers them, I would appreciate if she can share them. But not all the countries, for example, acknowledge the existence of Indigenous peoples, and just denying the existence, it's already about the start, right? Because if we want to do policy and we're not considering we exist, then I don't know. I think the answer you require, it's pretty complex, but I think we like doing some steps. Something I didn't mention and that we feel proud about is like last year, for example, with the UNA Food System Summit, Indigenous peoples were denied initially a coalition. And it was thanks to the advocacy of many leaders, people working on different fronts, and in Nurman, which was in the first conversation that Luisa hosted, and other people from different regions of the world, the willingness of some governments, among them Mexico, Norway. I'm gonna be bad now remembering all the countries, but there are 7 countries that were endorsing the coalition, and it's also, I think, if we work together also as indigenous peoples and try to create these synergies, we can push and create good things. But I guess sometimes it feels that probably we are working and doing things in an isolated way, and then we need to create synergies. That's why I mentioned again the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples Food Systems, because what we precisely are trying to create is a platform where we can bring not only Indigenous peoples, but people that is interested in working with us in advocating for Indigenous peoples food systems as game changers.
Thank you, Tania. Binti has a question. The floor is yours, Binti.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Tania, for sharing all your knowledge with us. I'm curious. I'm from an indigenous community in Nepal, and I am very curious to know about this oral tradition. You know, a lot of our knowledge within the indigenous community is also transferred through this medium. And often knowledge is also shared in an informal setting. But recently we are losing a lot of that food knowledge due to changing factors, obviously. And I am curious how you are able to adapt with this form of tradition while also gaining education in a structure or getting qualification. Thank you.
No, I think you have a good point, and I think there are some efforts already. I was reading in Arizona, I think, or New Mexico. I cannot recall now, but there's an institute or a researcher from one of the First Nations in the U.S. that it's combining astronomy and oral knowledge, because, like you said, there's a lot of things that we are losing when they, because the way indigenous people's knowledge works or is systematized, it's a bit different, right? But just to give you another example that I like, which is the Wipala paper, and it sounds like I'm making a lot of promotion to the Wipala paper, but there was also another publication that the Indigenous Peoples Unit released last year. I'm gonna put it later in the chat, but I think first with the Wipala paper, what we did was to gather experiences from 60 contributions, which also meant many of these contributions were oral. Someone has to do the work of translating that. Yes, I understand it's not ideal because we still like relying in the written formats, and that we should be moving into something else like an oral format, which would be, I guess, lovely. Nevertheless, I think it's just like trying to see how we can translate and make these synergies to connect the different sources of knowledge, different ways of storing, doing, gathering knowledge, and trying to put it into a written format. It's interesting. It was important, and let me tell you why it was important. The scientific group of the UNA Food System Summit acknowledged the Wipala paper as one crucial contribution and recognized the value of indigenous people's knowledge as game changers, which was a big thing for a scientist. Saying that was so important already for us. And a lot of the things that we did in terms of advocacy during the whole Food System Summit was based on the experiences reflected in the Wipala paper. So yes, I agree, it's not ideal yet because this is still a written format, but I think there are ways in which we can connect and translate that knowledge. And again, I will come to the part of synergies. I would be happy to explore it in the coming years if we could, like, instead of doing written formats, we can have something more like in an oral way. But I'm not sure if that's going to happen. I've been having discussions with some of my friends because that's something that we want to explore. We don't know yet when we're going to do that and how that might happen.
Thank you, Tania. That question might be also connected to Amber's question about how can stories be valued as much as papers?
Sorry, can you repeat, Luisa?
Amber, she asked, like, how can stories be valued as much as papers? Like the story of the Tadu Dao and the Great Lake of Peace shows examples of how people can change away from warmth. Stories are important, so this is how important for the survival of humanity.
I get your point, and I have to say, I think in this path, I'm gonna just like reflect from my own path. Yes, I think my story or my advocacy work has become stronger when I mix it. Some of the scientific facts, some of the scientific things with the stories that I have learned from people in the field. I'm not saying this is ideal, but I think we also have to learn to hack narratives, dominant narratives, and that's an ability that we should develop. I don't think it should be, that should be the way. I'm not saying that I agree with that. What I'm saying is, like, we have to play with the system in such a way that we can start shaping it and turning it in a different direction. I think that's the message I want to give. I don't think there's like an ideal answer, but I think I think it's sad just because thinking on how we legitimate the voices, right? I don't think it would be the same Tania speaking if my grandmother were speaking here, probably she would be regarded as just a wise person. But the legitimization that I get, in a way, it's because of all the academic career. And I'm not saying I would actually give more credit to my grandmother than to all the degrees I got in university, but that's not the way the system works. And then we need to, like, again, I said, shape the system a little bit and start playing with it in a different way. I know it's not the right or the best answer, but at least I think we can, like, find some of these cracks within the system and start, like, playing with it and trying to turn it and shape it into another direction. Sorry, it's not the best answer. I have to apologize.
Thank you, Tania. We're gonna go with the last question from Sancho Kular. So the floor is yours. You are muted, sorry.
Hi, everyone. I might not be really putting a question, but then trying to link up what Binti asked and also Mahar. Or I know my friend Seno from Nagaland is here. So, like, one of the problem that we have in India, for example, many of the indigenous language, the smaller languages that are still not recognized by the Indian government, it is very impossible for us to really work towards revitalizing or enhancing and promoting our language. But like what we really need to do in one way is like the community initiative where we come together, especially like oral traditions. Today, one of my uncle who turned 92 passed away. And that is a great loss because all the stories that he knew, all the crafts and everything that he knew pass away with him when any elder dies. So that way, it is very also urgent that we start, I think, learning from them, from the elders, as well as trying to do a video recording, keeping them so that we do not forget them. But then funding is another issue, or not knowing how to document is also one problem that the smaller communities faced. So there is a great need to help how indigenous communities can do their own story recording, how to preserve it, or even after recording, how do you really translate them, or the metadata processing, how do you store them, where do you store them, which will be the lasting place to store them. And again, coming back to the food, I know my friend Seno from Nagaland, they have been reviving all the nearly lost seeds. So we know many of the way how we do our agriculture practices bring back the soil fertility or retain the soil from runoff, and all those systems that really also need to be inculcated to our younger generations, because land, once it is gone, then once using the chemical fertilizers, pesticide, and all these things, the soil will go away. So in order to preserve our traditional practice of farming, which is very much environmental friendly, which is also a healthy food bank that we can save. So I think it is all this intergenerational process where we bring in the elders and bring in the younger people to interact and work together. How my friend in Nagaland, they are doing. If she want to add, maybe she can add. And then I saw in one of the questions that the lack of having schools or the government not recognizing a school. Even my own tribe, we don't have many schools in our tribe. The villages are far apart from one hill where you cannot walk to attend school in another hill. It may take you 4 or 5 hours, or it may take you even one day. So here, I think it is very important for us as community also to really see that we do some kind of actions by which we can start our own. It can be informal, but then how do we really preserve our own systems? And then also, I think lobbying, and then we need a larger network who can also help us pressure the government that these people really need a school building is needed, and funding is needed, teachers are needed, everything that is needed. I think the small communities cannot do things on their own, so networking is very important, and having this group, larger group like this, people from Asia, they can be helped by people here in the US or in Canada or in Australia or any other indigenous people across Africa or all these continents that can chime in, help send their support through advocating to the government. I think this way we can be a larger help to one another. A lot of things to say, but I should end here, Luisa. Thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you so much, Anshad, because you really addressed the question and comment that Yerva was putting in the chat about the lack of education, a lack of indigenous peoples, school from the Bata people from Burundi. So we have 1 minute left. So I don't know, Mathieu, you want to say something? So I will give you the floor, but please keep it short. Thank you.
Hello, I'm from Assam. I want to say that in our Assam, a small state of Indian northeastern region, in our state, different indigenous people's language is available. Our indigenous literary organizations also working for the development of the indigenous languages, but the government is completely silent. They not help us. So no books, no literature, and oral language also, different communities are also available. It is not preserved. And in this way, and again, I want to say that our indigenous rulers, our kings and the warriors, our historical monuments, the Raj Bhavans in different areas of Assam, it is also not protected properly. So especially we the indigenous peoples are facing a lot of problems. So in this regard, how can help us through the UN-based organization or the United Nations, as because of UNRIP, in UNRIP, it is clearly mentioned for the protection of the monument, historical monuments, and the languages. But till now, the government is completely silent. They have no any policy. They are not working in this line. So I completed these two questions just for the first time, and I request please help us in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Gervais, I give you like 30 seconds. Sorry, we are running out of time. You want to say something, to ask something, Tania, so Tania can wrap up. Thank you. He's muted. Okay, Tania, you want to say something about the previous comments so we can close the event? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. And I see the struggles that you have are the struggles of many other indigenous peoples too. But I think there are also grassroots organizations that are helping. I don't know if you heard from Cultural Survival, for example. That's one of my favorite organizations that supports indigenous peoples. And I think we can create synergies, but we shouldn't be disconnected, and we should follow each other and see how we can partner and try to create and shift things. But yeah, I wish I could help more, but let's be in touch and let's see what can we build together in the future.
Thank you so much, Tania. Thank you so much all the people who connected today and stayed 3 minutes longer of the expected time. It was such a pleasure to be here with you. Tania, thank you for such an insightful dialogue. We learned so much from you, and you are a very inspiring woman. And thank you all, and we will see you again in another dialogue. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Even though I didn't get enough time to follow, I thank you very much for sharing or information about indigenous people. I think that you've seen my comments. I have written it. Then, by the way, thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much, Ivan, for connecting. It's a pleasure to have you here and having your comments and insights too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luisa, for organizing.
Thank you so much. We are going to have the recording, a brief, so it's going to be posted in the Center of Human Rights and Legal Progress and webpage. Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Luisa.
Thank you. I think we can close it, right? Ciao. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Sharon. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you very much, Luisa. It was great. Thank you, Sharon,
Thank you.
for moderating.